All right, so we are in Lent. That's where we are. We're in Lent. And I'm curious, when you hear the word Lent, like what comes to mind for you? And I'm genuinely looking for like some response and participation. Coffee comes to mind for you?
Oh, like giving it up.
Oh, okay, there you, yeah. So giving up something dear to you. Got it, yes.
Coming out of Catholicism, the end of what Mardi Gras embodied, that fill yourself with everything the world has to give life and give it all up for Lent to sacrifice and be good enough.
Yeah.
I don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah. Fish fries on Fridays. I like it. Yeah. A couple others. Any more? What's that? Somber. Yeah. Sacrifice. For sure. What's that? Reflection. Yeah. Yeah. So this is my first time to really participate in all that Lent has to offer. There have been a handful of specific instances, of course, Lent being, the 40 days from Ash Wednesday all the way up until Easter. And so I've participated in some fasting before in previous contexts and with previous churches. Obviously, a lot of Good Friday services, so some Holy Week observance. But this is the first time for like our entire family to participate in Lent. And it's been quite humorous, if I'm honest, about how this is going down. So I had the clever idea of a family fast from all screens at our home. And so that was met with my 18-year-old saying, I am not Catholic, I am not Vineyard, I am non-denominational, and we don't practice Lent. My 13-year-old, she says, well, here's the deal. As I understand it, in Lent, you get to choose what you fast. It's not chosen for you. So I object to this. And then, of course, our youngest, our 7-year-old, he's just on board, man. And he immediately got out our whiteboard calendar and put in all of the dates from Ash Wednesday to Easter so that he could mark them off so that he could return to his Switch. But right alongside that, he has like, these are the things that he can do while he's not on screens. So we're excited about being in this Lent space together as a family. And it is interesting kind of how there is so much for us to engage and maybe even get like cluttered with. And so what my encouragement to you as we step into Lent together as a church family is that you will really, may we tap into the relationship potential of this season. And so if you do fast for something, man, my hope and my prayer for you is that it wouldn't be about what you are removing from your rhythms, but it would be about the room that you are making to be close to Him. Because those things are just so interestingly difficult, right? It's easier to get caught up in the thing that we're removing as opposed to the room that we're making. So let's focus on the room that we're making. You'll notice, so our theme for Lent this year is still life. And the reason why is because I was talking with Judy. She's a photographer, for those of you who don't know that. And as we were talking about that, we were talking about still life photos, which is a lot of the work that she does. And so she was showing me her work last fall. We began to have this conversation about, man, like you don't see a lot of still life art that involves human beings, right? Because it's typically an inanimate object. And we are not inanimate objects, right? We get to move. At the same time, we do have moments when we're still. And so we had this really fun idea about gathering some photographers and opening up to those that are friends and family of ours and say, hey, guys, would you please lead us in a gallery for Lent and capture moments where humans are the most still and yet the most alive. And so as we kind of still ourselves in this Lenten season, perhaps sacrifice, perhaps move something from our rhythms or our habits to find ourselves closer to the Lord, I would encourage you, enjoy the gallery out front in our lobby area as we want to just pursue the Lord together. The one thing that we are doing as a church family is we have a reading plan. So if you haven't heard about this yet, we have a reading plan for the Lent season. And it's on our website. That's the first place that you can access it. So if you go to our website and you go to resources, you'll find all of the details about the reading plan, like why we're doing it, where all we are doing it. So we're going to be reading the book of Luke. And so we even have these really cool journals that I found. It's the ESV translation, and each page has like a page of scripture and then a full page to take notes. And so you'll find the link for this journal on that page. If I could really encourage you, though, the thing I'm most excited about is that we have this texting option. So if you will text that little underlined portion at 2BDBD8D to that number, 81010, it'll connect you with the Remind app. Now, it might ask you to like download the app. You don't need to do that. Once you've texted that information to that number, it locks you into our Lent like group of people. And that group of people will receive a text message each morning at 5 a.m., because I don't know when you get up, right? But it'll be there when you get up. And it simply says today's reading and the date and a link. And you hit that link, and it takes you right to Bible Gateway, right to your reading for the day, which is one chapter a day for the entire time of Lent. And so I would really encourage you. I've already had some great feedback of how wonderful it is that you're one click away from the reading on your phone. We are going to read only for the weekdays. And what's really fun about this particular Lent season is that we're going to be studying from what we're reading all the way up until Easter. And so right now we're in the book of Ruth. And the reason why we're kicking off with the book of Ruth is because of the fact that Ruth is a story of Boaz and Ruth and Naomi. But Boaz is referred to as a kinsman redeemer. We'll talk about that today. And how he is a type and shadow, a foreshadowing of all that we have in Jesus Christ. And so we started with the book of Ruth. Next week we'll step into the book of Luke. And we even have like it peppered with some chapters from Isaiah and even one from Psalm 22. We do want to share in this together. This is something that not only can we do as like a Lent practice, but we can do it as a family. I'm already noticing from Reed and from Mark and from some others, they're like, man, like we have a common conversation topic because we're both reading the Bible together in the same content. And then finally, I won't go into a lot of the detailing about soap, but it's not just a Lenten practice, but it really is an appointment with the Lord. Each weekday, we'll get a chance to connect with the Lord. So it's not like make sure you read these, 28 chapters, 32 chapters between now and Easter. It's just that, like next Tuesday, you've got a date with the Lord in a particular chapter of the Bible, right? And then Wednesday, another appointment with him. So if you miss Tuesday, don't beat yourself up about it. Just be sure and catch him on Wednesday, right? Don't try and catch up. If you want to catch up, fine, but don't wear that weight or that guilt, because it's not about getting all 40 of them right. It's about spending more time with him and spending more time with him together. So, we are going to be in Ruth 1 and 2 today. And so as we step into that, I want to give you kind of just a snapshot of what we're looking at here. So this is the Old Testament book of Ruth. It's only 4 chapters long. It's a really great story that revolves around 3 main characters. And those are Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. And so Naomi is introduced at the very beginning of the book. And I would say before you get even like 10 verses into the book, she's already had some significant tragedy happen in her life. And so her story throughout the book is this move from tragic hurt to true healing. So we see that in the person of Naomi. Now Ruth, who obviously the book is named after, she has this wonderful story of where she marries into a family. So Naomi, she's Jewish. Ruth is actually not Jewish. She is from Moab. She's a Moabite. So she marries into the family of God. Not only does she marry into the family of God, before the story is over, she becomes a true sister and daughter in the faith to Naomi. So she not only finds her home in the family of God, she becomes a significant contributor to those who are with her in the family of God. And then there's Boaz, again referred to as a kinsman redeemer. And we'll have more detail as we get to his spot in chapter 2 today. But what we see in Boaz is this incredible foreshadowing of all that we have in our Redeemer, Jesus Christ. He's positioned as a man of kindness, generosity, and joy that really I do find quite encouraging. So we won't read all of the first 2 chapters that we read over Thursday and Friday because the reading plan began on Thursday. But we do want to cover them today. I want to kind of go through that part of the story, the first half of the story together. So the book of Ruth begins like this. There is this man named Elimelech. Elimelech, thank you. See, those are the ones that have read right there. They can fact check me right now. Elimelech, and he is in Bethlehem with Naomi. They have 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And it says that a famine strikes Bethlehem. And so because of that famine, they move out of Bethlehem and Jerusalem into Moab. And then really shortly after the move there, Elimelech dies. And so Naomi is there with her 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion. And Mahlon and Chilion, they find Moabite wives. The first one is named Orpah. When I hear Orpah, I mention they're like, Orpah! It's like this enthusiastic hello. I don't know. That's what's that. It always happens in my head. And then Ruth, right? Ruth is the second one. They are married for about 10 years and spend about 10 years there in Moab. Naomi, Mahlon, Chilion, Orpah, and Ruth. And then both of the sons pass away. And so before we are even 6 verses into this story, Naomi has lost her husband and her 2 sons. And she's left with her daughters-in-law and a lot of hurt in her heart. And so they get word that the Lord has blessed Bethlehem, and they decide to return. Of course, in this day and age, it was difficult for women to have like generous provisions for themselves without a husband. And so it was desperate for them to get back into a space where they could be supported by family. So Naomi's going to make the move back to Bethlehem. And at first, they agree together. Naomi and Orpah and Ruth are all going to go. But even just a few steps outside of Moab, they don't get far at all. Naomi turns and says, look, I really don't want you to go with me. The bitterness of my life in the midst of these circumstances is really too great for you, and I don't have to share that. You will have more of a future and more of a life if you remain here and in the homes of your husbands. And at first they say, no, like we want to go with you. And it says that there are both tears and kisses and crying. They have a moment of grief and affection together. And so they say, no, we want to go. And then Naomi just encourages them, no, please, I encourage you, turn back. Because they have this rhythm and ritual that if a brother is married to a wife and the brother passes and he has a younger brother or another brother, then one of those other brothers can then take his place in the marriage and become the husband of that wife. Well, in this case, Naomi has no other children. And so she says to them, guys, like, even if I were to, like, meet a guy today and get pregnant tonight, like, are you actually going to wait 18 years for these? She's like, please, like, this is where our stories separate, is what she says. And so Orpah listens, kisses, and cries again, and she makes her way back into Moab, right? And then Naomi turns to Ruth, and she says, you need to follow Orpah. And Ruth, this is one of the strongest moments in the story. She begins to utter her famous words. This is in verse 16. Ruth says to Naomi, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. I will go where you go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. And where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. And then when Naomi saw this, when she saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she says no more. It says the two of them go back to Bethlehem. And as they get there, there's a lot of great commotion about Naomi's return. And everyone is quite excited that she's there. And they start calling her by name, Naomi, Naomi. And she says, do not call me Naomi, which her name means pleasant. She says, call me Mara, which means bitter, because the Lord has dealt harshly with me. And it also tells us at the beginning of chapter 1, that it was the beginning of the barley harvest. And so I want to put this up for you. These are, again, the three characters that we see. So I like using the word, I'm not one of those preachers that likes everything to begin with the same letter, which is funny because, like, here it is. I'm a person who really appreciates patterns and just loves alliteration. And so you're going to see it occasionally with me. But Naomi, she is processing. When we look at Naomi's story, we do see that she is hurting. And yet at the same time, we do see a kindness in Naomi and a strong belief in Naomi. We see wisdom with her not depending on the daughters-in-law to come with her, but she's self-aware. She understands where her story is and where their story is. But there is this significant discouragement. In fact, she says more than once that, what's happening in her life is God's hand against her. And so there's an ownership of what's happening between her and the Lord that I would say isn't true. It's not true that God's hand is against her. There's a reference in her owning of that narrative to Judges 2:15. So the book right before this, Judges 2:15, it talks about where the Israelites, they were being disobedient to the Lord. They had left him behind. That they have disowned the Lord. They're worshiping other gods. They're not paying him any regard or mind. And in the midst of that, the Lord then does stand against them in battle. In Judges 2:15, it says, he stands against them in battle. But we don't see any kind of disobedience in Naomi's story. Right? We see her pledging allegiance and faithfulness to her husband in this movement. We see all kinds of, so this ownership of I have a lot of hardship happening in my life, and it's because God is out to get me, or he's pouring frustration or hardship upon me. It's just simply not true. And so I hope that we can be encouraged that we would know the difference between when reality hits us, despite how hard it is, or when we're making some decisions that bring hardship upon us. My encouragement to you, though, is that we wouldn't be discouraged or own a narrative that isn't true when it comes to God. Not giving God credit then for things that are just hard in our lives. But she's navigating all of that. Again, as far as the belief, you can see her speaking blessing and encouragement over Ruth and over Orpah. So her heart is strong, but it's processing a lot. Ruth is pursuing. There's just a beautiful determination that we see throughout the book of Ruth regarding this woman. Her commitment, her resolve, her hard work, how she has a grateful heart. There's this genuine, forward momentum nature about Ruth. And then finally, Boaz. The more and more we get to meet him, the more we get to see how kind he is, how generous he is. There's just this peace about Boaz. He's got this situated space in his wealth and in his season of life that allows him to not only be kind and generous, but observant and curious and complimentary. So as we take in these three characters, I have some questions for us as we step into Lent. How are you coming into the Lent season? If you were to just take a moment and be like, okay, are you processing a lot of hurt? Do you find yourself, right now I've got a lot of natural forward momentum, either in my natural life or in my spiritual life. Maybe it's a great season of peace. Maybe none of those things describe you. There might be something else. But I think before we leave today, I want us to sit with that question and begin to be able to articulate, man, this is like the position of my heart as I come into Lent. And then if you could pick your heart posture 40 days from now, what would that look like? At the end of these next 40 days, as we find ourselves at Easter, what are just a couple of things that you would like to intentionally position yourself in the presence of the Lord, gain in your relationship, leave in your wake? And then what would have to be true in order for that to happen? What could you engage? What could I engage to see that come to light? Boaz is introduced in chapter 2. And I believe in verse 20, he's called a kinsman redeemer. And a kinsman redeemer is a male relative who helps a weaker relative in need or in danger. It goes beyond mere marriage proposals. So they're not just, marrying in and stepping in a husband's space and say, but this person avenges, delivers, rescues, and in many cases redeems property. The role extends far beyond nuptial duties. What I want to do as we wrap up here this morning is I want to look at chapter 2. And I hope this quick glance at chapter 2 encourages you into how, like, when we just open up God's Word with the desire to meet with Him and be reminded of Him, that we can see in this foreshadowing of Boaz all that we have in Jesus Christ. So here's a glimpse of Jesus in Boaz from one chapter. Chapter 2, verse 1 says, there was this wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech. So first off, we know that the Lord is wealthy and influential. It says, one day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who's kind enough to let me do it. And so Naomi replied, all right, my daughter, go ahead. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. And while she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. And he said, the Lord be with you. He brings and speaks the blessings of God. And then his harvesters replied, the Lord bless you. Then Boaz asks his foreman, who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to? Know that Jesus sees you as Boaz sees Ruth. And the foreman replied, she is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters, and she has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes when she was resting in the shelter. So Boaz went over to Ruth. Jesus steps toward you. And he says, listen, my daughter. Jesus encourages you. Stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right here behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting and then follow them. He says, I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. Jesus protects and defends. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water that they have drawn from the well. She doesn't have to draw water from the well. She is welcome to enjoy what has been drawn. So all that he has, he shares. With that particular one, it reminds me of Luke 15, the story of the prodigal son, when the father tells the older brother, right, like, all I have is yours. All I have is yours. Ruth fell at his feet, and thanked him warmly. She said, what have I done to deserve such kindness? She asked. I'm only a foreigner. Yes, I know, Boaz replied. But I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. Jesus knows you. And I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, may he reward you fully for what you have done. The Lord honors good works. And I hope you hear that that's not like, we have to like do good works to get his good graces. It's something like when we see God's goodness and it inspires us to like walk in his wake and be as he be, the Lord honors that. Y'all feel me on that? It says, I hope to continue to please you, sir. Ruth replied, you have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I'm not one of your workers. The Lord is comforting. At mealtime, Boaz called to her, come over here. Help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in our sour wine. So she sat with his harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat, and she ate all she wanted and still had some left over. The Lord welcomes you to his table, and you can eat your fill. And when Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men, let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up and don't give her a hard time about it. So we see a more than generous God. And there's one more. I'll skip ahead just for the sake of time. This is in verse 21. So Ruth goes back and tells Naomi all that happened that day, all that she encountered. And Naomi says, may the Lord bless him. He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our close relatives, one of our family redeemers. And then Ruth said, what's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until the entire harvest is completed. And here's Naomi. We're not even in chapter 3 yet. And she says, good, with an exclamation point. It's verse 22. Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in another field, but you'll be safe with him. His kindness brings hope. As we step into the Lent season, man, and as we step into this reading plan together, again, it's an opportunity for us as a whole family to be reminded of all that we have in God. So I encourage you, join us as we step into this together, because there's a couple of things that I want to invite you into an adventure of seeking for him, seeking first his kingdom, and allow his word, allow it to remind you of his heart. When we gathered on Wednesday night for our fasting Ash Wednesday service, there were two things that came up in the midst of that. One is that we're doing this thing together. There's a togetherness and a connectedness that's happening. And then Mark also mentioned about expectation. There was just this energy of expectancy and anticipation as we step into God's word. And so even as we go into this Lent season, and yeah, it's got a lot of interesting baggage to it, right? There's a lot of, but we know what we're in store for.